Anthony, leaving aside the Bible, which Second Temple period or earlier sources are an accurate representation of your view of Satan and demons?
Well, my answer to that is I'm not interested in that. This is a Bible discussion. You're not proving anything. I know that the Jews believed in the Yetzer Hara. I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that's not in the Bible. I know they talked about the Memra, but that's not in the Bible either. So I understand this to be a Bible description. So what happened to Jews is irrelevant to me. I don't need to deal with that, as long as I've got scripture. I am right then in you're saying clearly that there is no internal Satan equals human nature example in the Old Testament period.
Not in the word meaning the word Satan, no. But I do know that the word was used in that sense in the intertestamental era. So the concept was well established by the New Testament, and it's derived, of course, from Genesis 3 and Genesis 6.
So again, though, you're appealing to something outside of Scripture. You're saying that it was well known in that your view was well known in the intertestamental period. Therefore, the Bible has to reflect that. That seems to me a bit of an assumption. Again, if I limit myself simply to Scripture, which I know many scholars would think is naively stupid and simple, and you'd come under that condemnation too. But if I just work with Scripture, I don't find the Yetzer Hara or anything of that intertestamental period. I don't have to explain, I think, why that has affected what they say in the New Testament.
I'm not sure what you're saying. Are you saying that you don't see the Yetzer Hara in the Old Testament, or you don't see it as addressed as Satan in the Old Testament?
I'm saying that I don't think that Yetzer Hara is not found in the New Testament at all, nor is it found. That Hebrew phrase, as far as I know, doesn't exist. So that becomes an external, extra-biblical idea that you say must be there because it's used in Matthew 1.
I see it as just another way of describing what is actually already in the Old Testament. The evil imagination, which is there in Genesis 6, for example. It's just another way of saying what's already in the Old Testament.
Okay, now that's fine. Would you explain to me how the internal flesh devil definition is there in Genesis 6?
Oh, well, it's right there in terms of the evil imagination of men's hearts, right there in Revelation, in Genesis 6, when God said that the thoughts of man were evil continually. That was, in fact, one of the cornerstone verses in the intertestamental era on which the concept of the internal evil inclination was based.
Yeah, but you've already conceded that doesn't equate to the devil. You've already said that the devil or Satan is never ever the internal thoughts and heart. So you're making a connection there that seems to be illogical on your own basis.
What I'm saying is that term wasn't used, but the concept was there, and I think that's the important thing. The concept is there in the Old Testament.
Yes,
it's just get a different name by the time we get to the New Testament, but the concept is right there, and that's why exactly why the intertestamental Jewish commentators found it there in passages like Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and even Zechariah.
I would like to see a completely clear quotation that they say that the Yetzer Hara is exactly the same as the devil, which would mean then that the devil, as you agree, is not in the Old Testament as internal nature, but the idea is. I still want to see where they call that idea. You have a good text there in Genesis, very good. The imagination of the heart was very bad, but I don't see that equated with the word devil in the Old Testament, and nor do you.
No, that's what I'm saying. You simply just, and because the word Satan and of course devil were generic terms, they weren't proper names, and so consequently, it's not a matter. It's really not a big deal to me that the word wasn't that particular word wasn't commonly used until the Second Testament, intertestamental era, because the concept is right there.
And it must therefore be true that what is meant in Matthew 4 is the Yetzer Hara, is your conclusion.
Well, I think that is a natural reading given the socio-cultural context. I mean, it's using the language which Jews actually did use of that particular concept. I mean, you would be familiar, of course, with some of the intertestamental literature that I cited, for example, like the Qumran text, the Prayer of Deliverance, Baki Nashi, and other texts like Sirach and 4 Ezra and 2 Baruch, identifying the Satan as the evil inclination.
I'm very interested in that point. I would like to see the actual equation of the word Hasatan or the Avalos with the Yetzer Hara. Again, it doesn't convince me entirely because it's outside the Bible. I think the Bible stands alone. When you say, if I may take you on this question, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written for uninstructed Christians some peer review, please. I don't think anybody of our biblicist point of view would imagine such a thing. They would say the opposite. These are the absolutely foundational gospel of the kingdom sect, the teaching of Jesus. And you seem to want to get rid of this. You have your critics, as you know. So I've been following very carefully what they've said also. But can you substantiate that? On what basis do you declare that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not the absolute core of the teaching of Jesus for posterity?
Well, I believe they are. And that's precisely why new converts need to know them. I mean, I wouldn't expect a new mature Christian to need to be told, 1, that Jesus was born, 2, where he was born, 3, details of his life, 4, his teachings. I mean, as you say, these are the core teachings. This is literally what you teach a new convert. And Luke himself explicitly tells us in his first few verses that he's actually addressing a new convert.
So Theophilus, yes, I see that. Yeah, and so John then doesn't deal with demon possession. We're getting to the demon thing, of course, as well. So I can direct the question to you. Would you explain to me, how is it that a demon can have the knowledge that Jesus is the Son of God? That sounds to me like a personality. How is it that demons cry out and recognize that Jesus is the Son of God? What would you please substitute for the word demon there? When you read demons, let's take the James one. The demons believe in God and tremble. I want to know, what English words are you putting in place of demons there?
In James, I believe that's an ironic reference to the foreign gods, in the same way that older passages in the Old Testament speak of the gods of the nations fearing God, trembling, and bowing down.
Oh, ironic. I didn't get any sense of irony. What commentary on James says this is ironic? You've done a tongue-in-cheek thing, I suggest there, which you made up to fit your system, but James doesn't say, now I'm talking ironically, nor in the passages at all. So that's a problem for me.
That's okay. But I mean, Ezekiel and Isaiah don't say they're talking ironically either when they mention God's trembling and God's bowing down in fear of Yahweh. So, I mean, I don't think that's actually a problem. I think in context, you need to read James, as I've mentioned, in the broader context of what the New Testament actually says, and very importantly, doesn't say about demons. I mean, you have to explain where they all disappear to outside the synoptics. That's
not a problem for me at all, because when Jesus is there, the New Testament period seems to bring forth the demons massively. I mean, those are obviously entirely speculative ideas, but you can't build much on that. I'm struck with the fact that in the story of the boy who went into convulsions, I want to know why the demon was able to see Jesus coming.
I think this is incredibly unlikely for evil supernatural beings. They tend to demonstrate to Jesus and to God the immense respect of a typical first century Jew. So, of course, I don't believe these people were demon possessed. I believe that it was actually the person speaking. And remember, of course, that I'm arguing that these synoptics were, in their descriptions, referring to what people believed as demon possessed people.
Why then do the writers, let's take Mark 9 and 20, why does he deliberately assign intelligent personality to the demon? If what you're saying is true, it seems to me he works hard against you there. I want to know why we have either and a masculine participle. Please explain that masculine participle in 920, Mark.
Well, the same way that we would describe, for example, if somebody in Taiwan, for example, was speaking of a person who was demon possessed, and I referred to their demon possessed friend, I would refer to it in exactly the same way that they would, insofar as I understand that I'm approaching them from their personal belief system. And later, of course, I'm going to lead them away from that. But of course, from your point of view, exactly why is it that the demon is addressing Jesus with this kind of respect? I mean, these demons are addressing with Jesus with this kind of respect. And as I've noted, we even have scholars such as Dunn and Twelftree who acknowledge that passages such as Mark 9 are clearly referring to a boy with an illness, and that this, in fact, is a case in which we should demythologize, as they say at the text, and understand that this is a pre-scientific way of describing somebody who actually had an illness that we understand today. And I mean, these are people who obviously are not on my side. I mean, Twelftree definitely believes in demons, although he finds it very difficult to explain exactly what they are.
No, I see that. I understand that. It seems to me you've had to add a dimension here that isn't strictly in the text. If I didn't want you to believe that demons existed as intelligent beings, why would I go to all the trouble of giving that demon a masculine participle? This is an ad sensum thing. why would I go to all the trouble? Luke, the doctor, who wrote more of the New Testament, if you exclude Hebrews, than anybody else, would have to say the Bible is misleading me here, because it clearly says there are demons. And I'm talking to Christadelphians over the years. I'm finding they don't know the difference between a payer and a payee. They don't know the difference between a demon-possessed person. Granted that the voice, the vocal cords of the demoniac are used. I've found this by experience. I've really had a great blessing talking to numerous Christadelphians. They're not able to describe, to define, at least satisfactorily for me, what's the difference between a demon and a demoniac. What is the difference?
Well, the one is the demon, that is what people believe in, the false belief, and the other one is the person that they believe to be possessed by a demon. On the point of the perspicacity of Scripture, the clarity of reading the words, I mean, this is exactly what I mentioned previously. We read words and terms like Jesus describing the rich man Lazarus. I mean, if Jesus is trying not to convince people that immortal souls can burn in hell, then why would he teach people the parable of the rich man and Lazarus? And Revelation 14:11, why would it describe, and passages like this, why would they describe these apparent people burning in hell, these people burning apparently in a post-mortem state? On the comment about Luke, for example, when you're describing about why Luke would describe this way, it's significant. As I mentioned, Clinton Wayland says that Luke characterizes exorcisms as healings, which we would expect of a doctor. And in Luke, illness is never described as caused by demons. In fact, Luke 7:21, he says Jesus cured many people of diseases, sickness, and evil spirits. Likewise, Luke 8:2, some people had been healed of evil spirits and disabilities. Likewise, Acts 19:12, their diseases left them and their evil spirits went out of them. And then Matthew, of course, in 8:16, when it was evening, many demon-possessed people were brought to him. He drove out the spirits with a word and healed who was sick. And then Matthew says that this fulfilled the prophecy. He took our weaknesses and carried our diseases, not our demons. And of course, that also brings up Psalm 103, verse 3. It's another echo of that. He is the one who forgives all your sin, who heals all your diseases. So why don't they say that Jesus is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies of demonic exorcism?
Well, first of all, they do distinguish between exorcism and healings quite often. But the more powerful argument for me is that you cannot use the vocative case. You can't call to a demon if it's impersonal human nature. How can Jesus say, you evil spirit, come out of him? I made my point earlier on that if you address somebody with a vocative case, that's a person. At least all the commentators that I've not read all the commentators. We can't, play commentators. Colin Brown at Fuller is absolutely clear on my side of this argument. It doesn't make it right. But I'm not convinced, though, that you're avoiding the plural neuter verbs and participles. That seems to me to instruct us that the demons have personality. I find that very difficult not to believe.
Well, the point is, of course, I'm not making my argument from grammar. I believe that it means what it says, when that people actually understood that to be, for example, a demon being addressed, and that's fine with me. But on the point of view of whether it's possible to address Yetzirah, here's an example of, I mean, if you want to talk about the Yetzirahs, particularly the Yetzirah, I mean, this is an example of how we find the rabbinical literature referring to the Yetzirah. First, it is called a passerby, then it is called a guest, and finally, it is called a man. For it is said, and there came a passerby to the rich man. And of course, this is speaking of David's sin with Bathsheba. And the interpretation here by the Jewish rabbis is that this is actually a reference to David's Yetzirah. It says, he took this poor man's lamb and dressed it for the man that was come to him. And that's a rabbinical interpretation of 2 Samuel 2:12. Obviously saying that this is the Yetzirah, describing it very clearly as a man who literally came to David. Likewise, we find rabbinic commentary like this. If the evil Yetzer tells you, sin and the Holy One, blessed be he, will pardon, do not believe it. For it is said, trust not in a friend. And friend, it means none other than the evil one, the one's evil Yetzer. For it is said, for the Yetzer of man's heart is evil. And that, of course, is the passage in Genesis 6 I cited previously. The Yetzer's right there in the Old Testament. Likewise, we find in Talmud Babylon another example of a conversation with the evil inclination. I looked at my reflection, and my evil impulse grew proud within me and besought thereby to remove me from the world. I said to it, evil one, have you a right to be jealous of a thing which is really not of yours, of something which is destined to turn into dust, worms, and maggots? And again, in the same parable is told in Talmud Jerusalem, I said to him, evil one, you should not take pride in something that does not belong to you, in something that is going to turn into dust, worms and corruption. So given the fact that we have this rabbinical witness, I'd say that this is a fairly natural reading of passages such as the temptation of Christ. And this is, as I've demonstrated, why quite a few scholarly commentaries, even those by people who do believe in a supernatural evil being and Satan, do not read the wilderness temptation literally.
Can you explain to me, how do you know the Jews hadn't got this wrong? They might have got this anti-supernaturalist idea wrong. So this is not a biblical discussion for me. As far as the evidence of the New Testament is concerned, I want to know of any leading commentary in our time who takes that view on the Matthew 4 passage. Your founders didn't believe it. That should make a Christadelphian at least scratch his head. Why was it that Roberts and the other man, Thomas, they absolutely didn't see an internal situation there? Why was that? Christadelphians learned that later, did they? You would answer by saying that? What happened? Why didn't they get it right from the start?
Oh, I wouldn't say that they learned that later. I mean, there were Christadelphians who disagreed with John Thomas and Robert Roberts on that point. I don't see it's particularly necessary to. I mean, John Thomas changed his views over time. Robert Roberts corrected John Thomas. He disagreed with him particularly on slavery. So I don't really see that as a big deal. I don't think, and I don't really mind if some of our founders got some things wrong and then we figured out they were correct after that you know what the whole idea was. I have mentioned, for example, on Jesus' temptation, that there were scholars who read it not only in the sense of a non-literal account, but also in terms of an actual belief in Jesus' internal temptation. I mean, I've got their visionary experience, a number of commentators, symbolic description, number of commentators, Jesus' life struggles dramatized, Jesus struggles with his adversaries, and of course the direct personal interpretation by Lax and Kesich. So this is not something that I've invented. This is not something that actually is unique to Christadelphians. And as I've demonstrated, an understanding which was accessible to a first-century Jew, particularly since many first-century Jews didn't actually believe in a supernatural evil demon or being called Satan.
I didn't know that. They didn't believe that, but when you come to the devil in the New Testament, then it would be natural for that idea of an internal Satan, is what you're saying. That would be an internal Satan.
Yeah, that's because that actually was a quite widespread belief. And importantly, there were very widespread, widely used words for a kind of evil figure, but they weren't Satan and Diabolos. They were words like Mastema or Shemael or Shamael. And why don't the New Testament use those if those were the words referring to this evil being?
Well, why? Okay, I can come back and ask you, why does Paul use the word Beliar? Why does Jesus obviously believe in Beelzebub? He implies that he believes it. Why does Paul use that word, Beliar, as a proper noun for the devil? That doesn't sound to me like the impersonal flesh. Now, by the way, we must agree, and I totally agree with you. The Bible talks enormously about the flesh that's in us. You know, I know that what's in me is no good, and so on. There's no disagreement at all. The disagreement clearly is that that's what they call devil, and you've already conceded more or less that in the Old Testament that wasn't the case. So for it suddenly to appear as the obvious meaning of, with a different meaning in Matthew, it's very difficult. So let me ask you, what is the meaning of proserchome?
It simply means to come, and of course it can mean come in a range of different contexts, including a literal or a non-literal context.
Yeah, but which one is it? Let's look at Thayer's. Let's look at proserchome in the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. Massive, or TDNT, I'm sure you're using it, Theological Dictionary of New Testament, the state of the art in words. What is the meaning of proserchome? It's not what you said. It's not vaguely figurative. It's simply a very, in all of the other accounts of it in Matthew, you wouldn't argue for a moment. The disciples came to Jesus. He came to the high priest. The high priest came to him. It's perfectly obvious as to how Matthew, don't you see any difficulty in that at all, making it a figurative meaning? Yeah.
No, not really. Firstly, because we both agree that the word means come, and that we both agree that it means come in the wilderness temptation passage. Let's have a look at Erskomai, BDAG, Acerkomai, to happen with focus on initial aspect, happen develop of thoughts. For example, an argument arose among them, the disciples, Luke 9:46. Now, would you say that that's an inappropriate description of what happened there?
Well, you're not talking about the right word. Proserchome, what does that mean?
Yeah, okay, of inanimate things, come upon, transperative sense, something comes upon or over someone. For example, it quotes the shepherd of Hamas there, which I'm going to look into in a moment.
Yeah.
Acerchomai, come into one's mind, and of course, proserchomai, of pain and pleasure, to be nigh at hand. Then, of course, in Shepherd of her mass, when I saw these things so ordered and no one in the place, I was amazed, and a fit of trembling seized me, and my hair stood on end, and a fit of shuddering came upon me. And there's proserchomai right there, because I was alone. And as I said before, I mean, all the other commentators that I've cited who still believe in a literal Satan and demons have no problem reading that word, understanding the Greek, and still believing that the temptation of Jesus was a visionary experience or a metaphorical description or some kind of other symbolic representation. I'm not actually alone here. There's no problem with the word. We agree on what the word means, and it can absolutely be used to describe something that figuratively came upon somebody.
Well, does it ever, according to Thayers, according to Begad, do they not say, first of all, it's used massively in a literal sense, and you wouldn't argue with 50 samples of that. Funny that you went to pagan Greek there. What in the Bible does pros erchome actually mean, according to Thayers, according to Colin Brown?
I don't think that the Bible uses a Greek that was different to what other people were using at the time. And both BDAG and LSJ and other standard lexicons agree on that. So I don't see the problem here.
Well,
none of them cite, for example, the wilderness temptation as an example of something literally coming on somebody, or demonstrating that this can only mean literally. And I mean, quite honestly, obviously, these lexicons say that this does not have simply a literal meaning and can never be used of anything figurative. I mean, they say the complete opposite. And there's an example right there, for example, in the Shepherd of her mass. And of course, if we look at acerchomai, there's even more examples. We're not really disagreeing over the grammar here. We both agree that something came. The difference is what we believe that came.
Well, it's the meaning of that word, and I don't think you've given us a biblical definition of proserchome, particularly in Matthew. Allow Matthew to use the word consistently. Where in the Gospel of Matthew does he ever mean anything other than a physical approach? You say the word came. No, it's not came. Proserchome is not just erchome, it's proserchome. He came towards him. You didn't like my translating that way. Well, many translations, of course, render it that way. So where in the Bible, leave alone Greek literature for a moment, where in Matthew is there anything like thoughts arising in my heart and so on? I don't find that. So you've gone outside.
I don't actually need to. I mean, the only thing I've gone outside is to demonstrate what the word actually means. And as I've said, I mean, you're not actually just arguing with me here. You're arguing with the scholars who can read that word, understand the Greek grammar, and still agree with me that it actually means something of an experience which was not entirely literal. It was a visionary experience, symbolic description, a dramatization, or even just Jesus' personal temptation. I mean, you have to explain how all those scholars can be wrong about the idea of that word. If that's what the word can only mean, then you have to explain why the lexicons disagree and why all these scholars somehow don't understand Greek. I mean, that's a pretty important point.
No, of course they understand Greek, but you're still talking outside of Matthew. The first thing in our examination here is
those scholars aren't talking about outside Matthew.
Please cite me a scholar who says that proserchome in Matthew 50 times doesn't mean a literal approach, coming to, not just coming towards, coming to. Where is your scholar who says this can mean figuratively ideas came into his head? One scholar.
Well, I've actually quoted you a couple of lexicons demonstrating that, and I've even quoted a case of a second century Christian text actually saying that. But again, you have all these scholars who interpret Jesus' temptation non-literally, so clearly they don't see the problem with the grammar that you're having here. They don't believe that word used in Matthew in this place actually necessarily means.
I would love to see those. If you'd put them up on your PowerPoint, I want you to say a scholar referring not to anything other than Matthew. Matthew's use of proserchome 50 times. A scholar,
but we're not talking about all the other 50 times. We're talking about how it's used here.
Obviously, understand words according to people, how they use them. If I say I'm mad about my flat, you're not going to understand me.
Luke only uses acerchomai once in 9:46.
I'm talking about Matthew.
Argument who rose among them. So I don't think that's a big deal either.
I'm talking about Matthew.
I know, but Matthew. But the same principle applies. Why can't Matthew use this word here in one of its many senses, just like as he used other words in their different senses in different contexts? I mean, context determines meaning, not numbers, and that's the point. You have to demonstrate either that this word cannot means something in a non-literal sense, which the lexicons say it does, or you have to demonstrate that all these scholars are wrong to say that this was a visionary experience, symbolic description, a dramatization, or Jesus' own personal temptation. I mean, they know the grammar just like you do, and they know the lexicons just like we do, but they're coming to a dramatically different conclusion. According to them, the grammar is not the deal breaker that you say it is. So why don't they understand that?
Well, I would love to see the evidence. If you sometime would send me.
We've talked all about Satan and demons in the Old and New Testament. Would you say that your understanding of Satan and demons is in the Old Testament? And if so, where?
The word Satan, of course, developed. It isn't the same thing all the way through. I fully grant that. There's a development. When we get to the end of Revelation, and Revelation is our final part of the canon, the definition is absolutely clear in 12:9 and in 20 verse 2. The devil is called. That in itself tells you it's a person, because the expression in Greek, to be called something, means that's your name. So the devil is named in Revelation 20 verse 2 and 12:9. Actually, 12:9 is even better. He's actually called. That phrase, to be called, throughout the Bible means your name. Could be a place, but when you're talking about persons, it's not an abstraction. You don't get called an abstraction. They don't talk about, say, wisdom, whose name is wisdom. We don't do that. So I want then the evidence that calling Satan the ancient serpent, obviously, who is also the Satan, is also devil without the article, not a devil. When you don't have the article, you, as Gesenius says so nicely, you're talking about a proper name. So you'd have to show me that that's not true. I grant your point entirely that you can have a Satan in the Old Testament. I know that. But here we're talking about the original serpent, who is the devil.
Just before I answer that, my original question was, do you believe that, and we can come back to this if you like, do you believe that your understanding of Satan and demons is in the Old Testament?
I do not. I say it's a developing thing, but the end of Revelation absolutely nails it.
Okay. No. Now, would you like me to address the point about Satan and demons? Okay.
Yes.
And I'm going to be quoting here from scholars who believe, of course, in a supernatural Satan and demons. Now, the point is that they understand that the devil, the dragon, and Satan is in Revelation is actually symbolic of Rome. Bredon here says Rome consequently becomes the beast, the devil, and Satan. Likewise, here the devil is generally thought to represent Rome. And of course, we are talking about the Revelation here. Likewise, Venks says, so we get a hint already that for John, the Roman power takes the figure of the devil. And likewise, he says the devil, when he says the devil will cast some members of the Church of Smyrna into prison, Revelation 2:10, this cannot normally be perceived as the work of the devil. Obviously, nobody ever saw the devil drag people off to prisons from Roman jails. Likewise, he said then, thus they are men who act. So it's the Roman governor who's actually represented here by the devil. Likewise, Venks says that before and after that, the text talks about the throne of Satan in Pergamum, and the text is likely alluding to the Temple of Divus Augustus and the Dea Roma as the oldest and most famous center of emperor worship. Likewise, Norman Hiller says about the same time that the book of Revelation pictures the Roman Empire as a satanic beast. Likewise, Richard Balcom says that the dragon in Revelation seems to be used as a symbol of political power in Mordecai's dream in the additions to Esther, and consequently, as he says, there are also a few texts which continue the tradition of Jeremiah and Ezekiel in which the dragon represents a great political power or ruler opposed to God. So we have this concept already in the Old Testament, and it's developed in the intertestamental era. Consequently, it's the same kind of image we see in Revelation. So Balcom says in Psalms of Solomon, the arrogant dragon who aspires to divine lordship is probably the Roman general Pompey. Likewise, and now he gets to Revelation 13, he says that the two great monsters represent the Roman power and the imperial cult of his time. Likewise, Beale says, Wisdom of Solomon, the sea monster is identified as Rome, and then he specifically talks about Revelation 12 and says it's talking about Rome pursuing God's new Israel into the wilderness and citing Sibylline oracles identifying Rome with the sea dragon. Likewise, Beale goes on to say that as in the Old Testament identifications of the dragon here in Revelation is to be identified with an evil kingdom, at least in part, first century Rome. And then he says that this is confirmed by the Daniel 7:7 and 24 allusion, since the fourth beast there also represents an evil empire and was identified in early Jewish writings as Rome itself. Likewise, Beale says that a proper understanding of the beast in Revelation 13:1-7 also bears this out. The seven diadems on the dragon's seven heads point further to an earthly king or kingdom. So it's very clear that there was a well-established trope in Jewish literature of dragon representing an evil power, specifically Rome. And these scholars are all saying, yep, no problem. The dragon, the beast, the devil here in Revelation is Rome.
So then when John, who wrote the book of Revelation, says the devil is the ancient serpent, that's not Rome.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly the point, that Rome is the preeminent manifestation of that evil power which started back in Genesis.
But he's not called the devil. That serpent is not called the devil in Genesis, but he is in Revelation 20, verse 2. I don't agree with you on Rome at all. I think that's wrong, but that's another subject for a different discussion. But would you tell me then about the beast? For you, that's Rome. You're
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that we have clear citations for that. There is, Balcom even says, we have found no Jewish precedent for this representation of ultimate evil, the devil, as the great dragon in Revelation 12:9. He has to concede, even Balcom and Beale both believe that Satan is in the book of Revelation.
Yes.
They believe that all the references to the devil, the dragon, and Satan are referring to Rome, and they say, well, it's actually Satan who is empowering Rome. So they place Satan behind the text, but of course they acknowledge that is not actually what the text.
Yeah, it is acknowledgement. They acknowledge it's not what the text says. And so in Revelation 13:14, let me ask you about this, if I may. The Therion, which is a dragon or a beast who comes up out of the sea, you know about that one. And why then is he given the relative pronoun in 14, masculine, breaking the laws of grammar to tell you that beast is a person?
I don't think it's breaking the laws of grammar at all. This is just a typical personification. I don't think it's a problem here. I mean, as I said, this is what Beale and Balcom say, so I don't see the issue here. This is personification in a highly symbolic book, so it's pretty much what we expect. Anthony, how would you differentiate between temptation from Satan and internal temptation?
I have no idea, but I'm not living in apostolic times. I'm not living in apostolic times, so there are no apostles. There are no supernatural gifts to the extent of the apostle things. Completely non-question to me, because I do not know. I mean, I can guess and I can surmise, but it doesn't matter to me at all. It's there in the text of Scripture. That's my answer.
I understand. Thanks. Would you acknowledge that first century Jews were able to tell when somebody was demonically possessed and when they were not? Would you say that they were able to?
I have no idea what first century Jews knew. I know that Jesus clearly talked about, it wasn't tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't tongue-in-cheek. Well, I mean, ironic, you see.
Jesus never diagnoses anyone as demonic possession. He only comments on what other people say about people being demonically possessed. Now, if we can't trust first century Jews to be sure if someone was demonically possessed, then we really don't know if these people were or not. Jesus never diagnoses anyone, and I think that's significant.
Well, Jesus goes, he speaks to the demon. You don't have to say, well, he hasn't diagnosed it. He jolly well has, to use my British. He speaks to the demon. You demon, come out of him. That's not diagnosing the problem. I don't know what would be.
Well, at the same time that the gospel writers sometimes tell us he spoke to the demon, sometimes tell us he spoke to the actual person. So it's clear that the gospel writers don't feel the need to make that distinction as clear as you're making.
I don't see why it proves that at all. It shows quite clearly that you're speaking to the person and you're also speaking to the demon. They're not the same thing. Otherwise, payer and payee are confused. Demon and demonized are distinctly separated for me in the story.
Okay, so would you say that today it's not possible to determine if somebody is demonically possessed? I'm
not into exorcism. I don't know that the demons are working in the way that they did then. I don't know that. Could be. There are people who have exorcist I'm not going to judge that. I don't know. I have no idea. What I do know from a language point of view is the text as we have it. Forget the Jewish ideas, forget the extra biblical stuff. What is presented to me in Scripture is absolutely unmistakable, that Jesus recognized the demon. For instance, he said, you demon, you deaf and mute spirit, I, Jesus, command you. Come out of the man, you unclean spirit. That's a diagnosis, isn't it?
I don't think that's a diagnosis, but I think it's important, because if the demon is mute, how's the demon speaking?
Well, the demon's speaking here in this
particular example. It's not speaking, is it? It's the person speaking. He's not really speaking to a demon, is he? He's speaking to a person.
No, that's not true.
When people are listening, they're hearing a person speak. I mean, the demon is mute. It says that in the text. The demon can't speak.
How can the demon be commanded? You deaf, is Jesus speaking now?
Yeah, I know. Well, we've already addressed it. I believe that this is an accommodation. But I mean, I think the main point's been identified. Do you believe that it's not possible to determine definitively if somebody is demonically possessed today, and you're not sure if
no,
demons are active now.
I'm not. I'm talking about the Bible. We're having a Bible discussion.
Yeah,
I'm
okay,
simply saying to you that it's clearly there in terms of the language. If you're reading the Greek, it's clearer than the English. If you're reading the good commentaries, they all make this point that the demons are more than clear. I mean, you've used a number.
Well, actually, they don't all say that.
Not
As I've demonstrated, some of them actually say something else, and some of them make the point that the person who is possessed is not always differentiated from the actual demon themselves.
Okay, not always, but when? What are you going to do with the ones where they are?
Well, when they are, that's fine. As I've mentioned, I don't have a problem with that, because this is accommodating people who do actually believe that, and that's why these, as I said, we don't find this in John, and we don't find exorcisms and demonic possession in Paul either.
No.
After the synoptics, they just vanish.
Your whole theory that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were only for uninstructed, I mean, nobody's going to agree with you on that one. That is really extraordinary. You've sort of downplayed Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I
don't think it's downplaying to say that this information in these gospels is so important that it's the first thing you teach to new converts or potential converts. I think that's.
But it's not truth for us as much as the new convert. I find that extraordinary.
Of course it is, but we understand it in a different way, which is why John had to be written. And then otherwise, what is the purpose of John?
John knew of the synoptic gospels. He didn't really need to repeat all that, but he would never have said that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are not inspired scripture with this.
I agree. But then John, of course, only ever speaks of people who are unwell. He never speaks of demons. He talks about the blind, the lame, the withered, the sick, the impotent, suffering from infirmity or disease, but never suffering from demons or Satan.
But Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. You're always avoiding the evidence as it really is.